Hello folks, Larry here again with Curio Mechanics. In today's video we're going to do a quick rundown of virtual machines, what they are and why you'd want to use them. In a nutshell, a virtual machine is some piece of software that lets you basically slice off computer resources and build a little box that you can use to install different operating systems or section it off from the rest of your machine's resources. For most people, it's going to be kind of a playground to try different things. It can be considered somewhat of an emulator or a compatibility layer, but its main purpose is, like I say, to isolate one piece of system or software from the rest of your computer. And so just for fun, we're going to kind of run through here and install Windows 95. Now, the software that you use for Virtual Machine Manager varies, but they behave pretty similarly. So the first thing we need to do is just create a new machine, or tell the Virtual Machine Manager that we want to create a new machine. And in this case, it's letting us select an ISO, which will be mounted as a virtual CD drive so that we can install our new operating system or software. So we're going to go through the options. Now, modern virtual machine managers are very good at recognizing what you're trying to install and giving you some pretty good defaults for how to set the machine up. So you really can customize it if you choose, but in a lot of cases the defaults are pretty well set up for what you're trying to accomplish. But again, because you're slicing off computer resources, it will allow you to tailor that pretty extensively and do what you want. And here I'm select the amount of RAM. Then we are going to create a virtual hard drive, which is essentially just a slice. It's a file, and it tricks the operating system into thinking that's the whole hard drive. And when I say trick, they do use hardware virtualization features that your CPU needs to support. And in most cases, it's capable of it, but it may or may not be turned on in the BIOS. So I'll just warn you of that if you're going to follow along, and I suggest that you do try it because it's kind of fun. But if you have problems or you're getting messages from the manager that your machine doesn't support virtualization, there is a good chance that it does, but it's just turned off. But we've created our virtual machine parameters, and you can configure the hardware. So here I'm going to mistakenly add a second DVD or a ISO drive, basically a CD-ROM or optical drive, and it will allow you to map that to a real drive, or ISO files are a optical drive format. Think of it like a zip file for CDs is the easiest way to explain it. But it has everything you need packed in there. But again, with the hardware, you can configure it pretty extensively. Obviously, you can't make something you don't have. So say you wanted to run something with 64 processor cores and you only truly have a 32 core CPU, that doesn't work. But you can always go down. And a little tip here, you do want to leave enough for your underlying operating system, your real computer, to have enough to function. Don't give everything to the virtual machine. You'll find out quickly that it makes the experience pretty painful. But so we've got everything pretty much set up here. So it's going to allow us to select from different machines that we have saved. You notice I have a few tabs already, but here we go. So we're going to launch it. It's going to boot from the virtual CD, which it thinks is just a regular disk in the drive. So we'll go ahead and install Windows 95. And eventually we're going to get to one of the other strong benefits of doing it this way in a virtual machine, simply because if you goof it up, you can always go back and ungoof it. But because it sees itself as a blank hard drive, it's going to partition it, format it, and you're basically categorized as a host and a guest. The host would be the overall machine, the real computer you're working on, and the guest is the operating system running inside the machine. But the guest, for most older operating systems, don't have a clue that they're running within a container. But more modern systems do, and will allow you to install software that'll create a better relationship with that, or it will configure itself intentionally to work as a guest. So here again, we're going through just the basics of setup. The other thing to remind you, because you really don't have the ability to reach out at first into your, we'll say, reach through the fourth wall, basically, from the guest operating system into the host. Until you get it set up, you won't be able to do any drivers. It will be just dumb as a stump, because it, again, has no idea that there's a world beyond that container. And that's probably, in a business sense, one of the virtual machine in general strongest functions and features, is that you can do pretty much anything you want to it, and it won't affect the system that it's running on. Obviously, you can consume resources, but it will always be limited by the sizes that you gave it when you were setting up the machine. So again, if you left enough for the host system to operate comfortably, it won't take your machine down, and it can't access any of the software. So another great example of where you'd want to use a virtual machine would be virus testing. Whether you want to see what the payload is, try to take a shot at disinfecting it, mimicking various scenarios to see what impact it might have. Those are all good reasons to throw it in a VM, or it's just from an unknown source, an untrustworthy source possibly, because again, it's locked in its little box, and it can't hurt anything outside that box. So the very worst you'll do is just delete the machine, and the problem goes away, because again, it's really just a file on your hard drive or your storage medium, whatever you consider a hard drive these days. So it's pretty easy, and it's also good for testing. If you goof it up, you can go back to an existing snapshot per se, because it is possible to copy those files, the host virtual hard drive files, so you can have multiple instances of the same setup. And no matter what you do to it, you have a point you can fall back to. You can install it multiple times, testing multiple configurations of that machine to see, or operating system rather, or whatever you put in there, just to see how they handle different scenarios. So it's a great way to insulate your working system from whatever experiments you want to conduct. So here's a great example of where that comes in handy. I am wrongly trying to set up networking on Windows 95, and I don't have any drivers, so I'm just kind of blindly clicking stuff and screwing with the network protocols. And 95 didn't have a very wide range of choices for hardware installation. We've kind of got spoiled with Windows 11 and Windows 10 and Windows Update, even back to Vista. Most of the hardware that was on the market, Microsoft could get it up and running without having to have a manufacturer's disk. There were always updates that you could probably get from the manufacturer, but in most cases, it would at least get it to function. Well, not good old 95. It had pretty limited hardware support. It did the best it could, but it wasn't great at it. And so, like I said, this is me just screwing around with the network settings, and Virtual machines usually by default do have network access. They will share I/O resources, so you can have a sound card and a real CD drive and USB port access. But putting a Windows 95 machine on a real internet, not a great plan, but who cares? Because it's just a virtual machine, and if somebody jumps in there and scrambles it, whoop-de-doo. Have fun. But again, that's where the hardware you're on your host needs to know it's okay to share it. And by default, like I say, most of the time it has no problem with it. And the virtual machine manager software, the host software, is very, very clever about allowing that system, the guest system, to operate with resources that technically aren't really there, and can mimic various types of hardware. But out of the box, like I said, it tries to share the network through network address translation. It can actually tell if you're talking to the host or the guest, and traffic is routed accordingly. So say you're trying out something that is more modern and should be allowed on the internet, that's usually no problem. Again, right out of the box, it generally works. And like I said, you can make that true for almost any peripheral, but getting the I/O routing set up can get you pretty deep in the weeds depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But and here, like I said, in this case, I was just fiddling with the network settings, and it'll work great. No, it didn't, and here goes kaplooey, and it wants the disk for a network, and I don't have that disk. And the other thing I think this particular virtual manager did was, after the first restart, it actually kicks out the ISO file. In other words, it may have already removed the Windows 95 CD. In this case, so far, I think it's still there, but just know that for in a little bit further steps and certain software, depending on what manager you're using, it tries to help you, because if you leave the install disk in every time you reboot, it'll keep going back into setup. But that is actually not what you want. You want to eventually eject that disk and let it just boot off the virtual hard drive. Well, and like you say, and I think in this one's case, it may have been trying to save me from that mistake. But either, what you're seeing here is a more or less working installation of Windows 95, and it's running inside my virtual machine manager that's actually on Linux Debian 13. So, but Windows 95 has no clue of that. It thinks it's a single processor system, 64 megs of RAM, 8 gig hard drive. Everybody's happy. And so this is it trying to install all the hardware it sees. And this is me failing epically at trying to bypass some of these errors I've created for myself, which even when I did do it again and tried to avoid it, it did come up with some of this. But again, I just want to reiterate that the operating system has no clue that it's not in bare metal. There's no way for it to reach into the greater beyond and ask for help. So be prepared, depending on what you're installing and how old it is, to have all of those support pieces at your disposal. It's relatively simple to just keep mounting virtual CD images to get that information in there, but for the setup process, it can sometimes be sort of a nuisance, because again, it just has the install CD. So what you do is create a second virtual disk that has hopefully all the stuff you need, and then you can access that as a second drive letter, a third drive letter, a fourth drive letter, depending on how deep you need to go. But virtual machines in general are great for playing what if and how can I. And another great use for these would be to install an operating system or piece of software that you're not familiar with, and find out what you're going to run into if you did try to do it on bare metal. And like I said, you can very accurately configure the type of hardware that you're going to use or the scenario that it's going to be in. So the what ifs and the gotchas should occur in the same, basically you'll have the same experience that you would if you were installing it on a real computer. Like you say, the bare metal is what they call it if you're truly running on the machine. But this is me going in and asking Windows, well, what do you see? And then look there, 64 megabytes of RAM. And again, it has no clue that it's running inside of a container on a completely different machine. And that's the beauty of it. So that's why I'm showcasing it, because like you say, if you've never messed with them, they can be quite handy and really serve a good purpose. But the other beauty of it is here I completely screwed it up. So you know what? Bye. You just go in and get rid of it. And it's like it never happened. And of course, it says it's irreversible. You'll lose everything. Well, that's sort of the whole point. The one you see there behind it, Icaros, by the way, I just thought I'd throw in a quick, what is that? That was a fun little project I found where it's actually a bootable image of an Amiga operating system. And I threw it on an old Gateway laptop on an ISO or on a real burned CD. It turned out pretty cool. So I just tip of the cap to the Icaros people for what they've pulled off there. It was impressive, and it actually was kind of fun to use. So if you're an old Amiga fan, I'd, like I say, suggest that exists, and maybe you want to look it up. It did seem to be relatively currently maintained, but I didn't know much about it, so great use for a virtual machine. Throw it in there and see what it does. And okay, it worked great, so I decided to make a real thing out of it. So like you see there, I just screwed up, deleted the old machine, and created a new one, and go through the bouncing banana again. And luckily, Windows installs pretty quickly, so you do get the benefit of the speedier hardware, and it's kind of nice that these processes can go by so quickly. Those virtual hard drives are basically running on NVMe or whatever, even though it's using a different protocol to communicate. You still get a lot of the benefits of running it on modern hardware. So that's another kind of side bonus. And but there's the old activation code. So like I say, it thinks it's just a completely normal install. And go through the process. Different companies have different levels of support for virtual machines, but it was originally and most often intended for use in business scenarios. So don't be surprised if you run across, for free use only or paid versions. I know Microsoft, Oracle, and now it's Broadcom owns the one I'm running now, but because of their history, you might have to do a little digging to find out what's out there. But one from Oracle I know I've used pretty extensively, and it was very user-friendly to set up. These are not difficult to get running. You literally just download it, run or whatever, and all of a sudden you can click new machine. And like I said before, when it reads the ISO, it tries to pretty much identify what it needs to do and help you along. I believe it's going off the name, not the contents. So in other words, if you download a Linux ISO and name it Windows 95, I suspect that it will suggest to you Windows 95 settings, but I've never actually tried it. But the range of stuff it supports. Now, the one place I've had trouble is with Apple. Apple's extremely particular about the hardware that it runs on. I have gotten virtual machines to work with different, pretty modern flavors of Mac software, But it was a lot of trickery and a lot of work. And to be bluntly honest, I don't think it was worth the trouble. So just be aware that because of Apple's very specific firmware, you will have a harder time getting those to work. Linux and Windows, piece of cake. Haiku, BOS, I've tried, like I said, Icarus, no problem. So, but Apple likes to stay in their own little world, and so I just thought I'd throw that out there, that not everything will work perfectly without some tweaking. But here we go again. And by the way, that install bar is moving at real time, so when's the last time you saw Windows 95 copy all its files over in 30 seconds or less? So, but here we go, and surprise, surprise, I screwed it up again. But you know what? Nobody cares. It's pretty harmless. It's just there for a novelty. Now, I did notice that the sound driver didn't install, and we'll see the drivers here in a second, but there are some more tweaks I need to do if I were going to use this as, for some reason, a daily driver operating system. But again, that's kind of the fun of it, in a sense, is you get a clean slate anytime you want it. And again, for practical use, say you're setting up a home lab and you want to try these different, Plex and Media and OpenNAS and a lot of different task-specific OSs, or even if you want to set up a firewall, and OPN Sense is what I use, and it had a pretty steep learning curve at first. So I spent a little time goofing around with it in a virtual machine until I got it to where I think it was working right. And so it's like I say, it's a great tool, but you do, sometimes have to work your way through it. But that's its real strength, is no matter what you do to it, you can just go back to your desktop, play a game of solitaire, and come back to it later. Or, ask for help and find out what you need to do differently next time. So, but once you get it up and running, it's a lot easier to communicate with modern ones especially. There's actually what they call a guest interactions file. There's a lot of, it can run a piece of software that actually bridges the gap more elegantly between your host and your guest. So you can move files over. A lot of them have shared desktops and stuff like that. So once you find out what you need, you can go back later and add it in. And luckily, even Windows 95 here, it blows up, but it'll let you fix it later. And so but that's kind of the overview I wanted to give, is that it is a great tool. They're fun to play with and lets you play what if to your heart's content. And as long as you have hard drive space, you can continue to iterate and create as many machines as you see fit in whatever application or whatever the mood strikes you. And do terrible things to it and just move on with your life. Or do terrible things and go back a version, or uninstall, and it just, again, the sky's the limit. So for mainstream computing, it's fun sometimes to go back in time. Or again, if you have a home lab and you want to try out a million different options, or if you're new to Linux, it's great for trying out different distros they're called, and see which one you like. Okay, well, this does that does that. I don't understand what happened here. And, like here, I'm getting a bunch of driver errors. Now, I know they're all related to the network because I recognize the names, and frankly, couldn't care less because, like I said, the Windows 95 machine on the internet's just asking for trouble. But it would have been nice to communicate with my home LAN and get some basic stuff in it. But irrespective, and if you're kind of mad right now with Mr. Gates, this is one way to consider moving to a different universe and not hurting yourself. This is me trying the multimedia support and finding out that, well, I guess it didn't install any of the drivers that I was hoping for. And to be brutally honest, I just updated this particular host operating system. Don't even know what it's trying to emulate or what hardware it pretends to be. So I guess I'll just play a quick game of solitaire, because that works every time. But that's kind of it. Like I say, setting them up is very, very simple. Just find one you like, or find one that you can live with the license agreement. Download it, run the install, create a new machine, point it to an image of an installer for an operating system that you want to try out, and you'll find it very, very simple. You can create custom machines and then do whatever you want with it, but for starters, it's easier to download an ISO of existing software operating system installations and then let it just magically populate all the information. But again, for as far as the operating system knows, it's in its own little world. And relatively memory efficient. They're not heavyweight programs in and of themselves, the managers. The guest OS, that's totally up to whatever you're putting in there. But like I say, in businesses, they've used them for a long time simply because then no matter what a user does, they're caged, they're contained. And that's very, very important in business, that you only can get so far. Because believe it or not, sometimes people aren't happy and they do bad things. So if they're running in a virtual machine, they can't even screw up the operating system. They can just get a new copy of that hard drive file every morning, and it'll look exactly like it did when the IT people took the snapshot. So, like I say, this is me looking at the drivers and finding out that, well, okay, I've still got some work to do. But again, as far as Windows 95 knows, it's the only game in town. So, but there we are. We're back and shut it down, and everything's great. You do have the ability to I'll call it alt tab out, but you can still run your host operating system with the guest running. But for now, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to help support me on Patreon, I do have a Patreon channel. But in the meantime, if you're new to the channel, consider liking, subscribing, and I hope you enjoy your day.